going to speak about making the IRL National Park. He is the interim executive director in Indian River RiverKeeper. I'll read from my notes here. He's a husband and father, a Florida native, a resident of Stewart as well. He's traveled ways to get here. He's been a resident of Stewart for 31 years, civically engaged, passionate about protecting the lagoon and its coastal margins. He's currently chairman of the board, the director of the Marine Resource Council, and the interim executive director. He's been appointed to the Martin County Local Planning Agency since 2002. He's newest Indian River keeper. He's a position he's held for 9 months. He's also a member of the leadership team of the Rivers Coalition and a member in support of many local, civic, and environmental groups. Jim facilitates ocean science projects, specializes in bioacoustics, marine animal surveys, and development of autonomous vehicles and data collection devices. He's currently involved with several citizen science projects and marine mammal stranding networks. He often volunteered with coastal restoration efforts and exotic invasive species control programs. All right, let's welcome James.
Thank you. I recognize some of you, and many of you are new to me. My name is Jim Moir, and I love the Lagoon, and I really especially love the people who also love the Lagoon. I grew up in Key Biscayne, and when I was young, it was still a coconut plantation, and I watched it become what it is today. I moved to Stewart, became a boat builder, sort of became obsessed with my work for probably 12 years. And then a friend of mine asked me if I'd like to go tag right whales, and I said, sure. So I got involved with a group from Woods Hole, and that became the next sort of phase of my life, and that has been facilitating ocean science projects. While doing that and living in Stewart, I became more civically engaged and realizing that our environment was being challenged by development. One of the things that I remember reading about Martin County residents was that when Jonathan Dickinson State Park was being pressured by the federal DOT to move I-95 through it, a group of local residents laid down in front of the bulldozers and made them move I-95 out to the west. And I thought that was a really cool group of folks. And when I moved to Martin County in 1992, I got to meet some of those people. Didn't really integrate with them terribly much for the first decade and a bit. And then by circumstance started to find out what motivated them to try to protect the things that they love, and to what lengths they would go to protect the things that they love. I've been a volunteer and board member at the Marine Resources Council for about 18 years now. And I've been off and on board chair. About a year ago, I was asked to nominate or allow myself to be nominated back onto the chair's position. And then because this year we lost several employees and the executive director resigned, I have been the interim executive director and board chair for the Marine Resources Council. Also about a year ago, the executive director of the Indian RiverKeeper resigned, and I was about to do a boat delivery and really didn't have the sort of the bandwidth to go for another executive director search. So I said, sure, maybe that's something I could do. And so I became the executive director of the Indian RiverKeeper. So I'm wearing several hats. Turns out that last December, I was ferrying a group of lawyers from Earth Justice and several members of the Save the Manatee Club, and quite an illustrious group of local scientists. So Lisa Soto was one of them. Grant Gilmore, an ichthyologist from Harbor Branch, was another one. Alan Stewart, who is a ecologist as well as a professional engineer, sort of specializing in sewage treatment facilities. Dr. Edie Witter, who is the lead scientist for Orca, myself as the RiverKeeper, and a few other assorted, smart people were on this boat, and we were talking about the importance of the biodiversity of the Indian River Lagoon and how really the treasure of the Treasure Coast is the diversity of this lagoon. And the lawyers were there to investigate the potential of a lawsuit against the federal EPA to push the EPA to, let me see if I can get this best worded, to reduce the total maximum daily loads of nutrients into the lagoon. So they wanted to reduce, for the benefit of the lagoon, the TMDL. It's easy to interpret that as we want to increase the strength of the TMDL, but it's actually reduced the values. And so several years ago in the Scott administration, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection was defederalized. And so the authority for setting water quality standards were taken from the EPA and entirely given to the state's DEP. Since then, the BMAP, or the Basin Management Action Plan format, has been developed by the state DEP in order to reduce the nutrient levels and also several other water quality standards in the IRL and several other impaired water bodies across the state. It ain't working. We are witnessing, based on water quality data collected by other agencies, an approaching of those parameters that we hope to achieve, but the habitat is failing simultaneously. And so seagrass is a measurement of habitat health in the Indian River Lagoon is not recovering. In fact, we've lost probably 95% of the biomass of seagrasses in the Indian River Lagoon since 2011. And we're not seeing a whole lot of recovery. We are seeing some fits and starts, but if we're going to see any recovery at all, it's going to take probably 20 years and a lot of money and a lot of effort to do the replanting that's going to be required. But it's clear we can't replant our way out of this problem. We're going to have to rely on nature, and we're going to have to rely on extra nutrients being taken out of the system. I was speaking to a person the other day, and I was asked to try to develop an analogy, and I think that a good one, maybe not the best one, is a patient that has a sweet tooth and has become morbidly obese. And so the diagnosis was that this person is got increasingly bad health prospects, and there's been some kidney failure, and their livers aren't functioning as well as they should. So we're going to give this patient a gastric bypass surgery, but we're not going to give the patient any behavioral modification. And so this patient is on death's door and is going to need a lot of help to recover. But until we give it some behavioral modifications to live by, we're not going to succeed in bringing this patient back to a healthy state. So I suggested to Edie Witter that maybe a national park would provide the protections that the IRL needs to have the diversity in the lagoon protected by a federal standard. I live in Martin County, and our big concerns are about the Lake Okeechobee discharges into the Indian River Lagoon and the damage that those massive discharges of polluted water cause to our estuary. And we've lost about 87% of the male faunal community in that estuary in the last 10 years, which is devastatingly bad. It's the little tiny tube worms that are really quite foundational in creating a sediment that holds together and provides a substrate for the rhizomal community that lives within the seagrass roots. So these things are all failing around us. Everglades National Park has, with the tribes, the Seminole and the Miccosukee tribes, been able to sue the federal government to place a Q-bell over Everglades National Park, which limits the phosphorus amounts to 10 parts per million of phosphorus going from Lake Okeechobee and the management district through the South Florida Water Management District control structures, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers control structures, into the national park. There's a lot of controversy over the Everglades agricultural area and how much nutrients they are putting back into the system and allowing to get out of there. And they actually fill up the stormwater treatment areas with their irrigation water so that virtually no Lake Okeechobee water ever actually gets into those reservoirs and into those SDAs. The rig system, we're not going to succeed. The EAA is an incredibly powerful network of sugar growers and other agricultural interests. The truth is that South Florida has a surplus of phosphates. This is why we mine it, why Mosaic is a big company that's selling phosphate fertilizer to the rest of the world. In fact, Florida has substantial resources in phosphates that are probably equal to Morocco and some of the other exporting countries that export phosphates out. So our soils are saturated with phosphates. So any little bit that helps, and I think Lake Okeechobee's sediments are something like 500 parts per million, way over the limits that would be acceptable to Everglades National Park. So the idea that with federal backing, perhaps the southern end of the Indian River Lagoon would be able to adopt a Q-bell or a limit that would not allow the Army Corps of Engineers, that has transport authority to move polluted water from one polluted water body into another. Nobody else has that. The Western Rivers Act prohibits you from polluting downstream users. It's one of the tenets of the Clean Water Act. The Reclamation Bureau, when they set up the Western Rivers Act, realized that it was no longer allowed to pollute downstream users. But when the Army Corps of Engineers is, tagged or they're responsible for flood control, they need the authority to move polluted water from one body to another. They're probably not going to give that up. So the national park status would be a start to negotiating some sort of TMDL limitation or total maximum daily load limitation on the surplus pollutants that are allowed into our water bodies. It would also give national park stature internationally to a water body that is the most biodiverse in North America, and clearly worth saving on virtually every parameter one could measure. I would propose that we include the nearshore reef system as part of that protection, because they are connected. And the reef systems, from an economic perspective, are very important to us. One of the interesting outcomes is that as I think about this, I realize that there's a lot of negotiations that are going to have to be had. How do you accommodate a nuclear power plant in the middle of a national park? How do you accommodate some of the submerged land leases that are already in existence for clam operations in Grant or Valcarry, or power lines that cross the lagoon, or DOT rights of way that are going across the national park. I can't think of a single national park that hasn't had to negotiate similar issues with the previous landowners. Biscayne National Park that was mentioned was my backyard when I was growing up. And it took Congressman Danny LaSalle about 10 years to push that through the system and have it recognized as a national park. Pennycamp was just south of that. And so it had the ability to demonstrate the efficacy of having a marine protected area, an MPA, established around Biscayne National Park. There was a lot of controversy from the recreational fishing industry as well as the commercial fishing industry about whether that was a good idea. I have seen very few people who would say that Biscayne National Park wasn't a win-win-win for virtually every user group and stakeholder that may have been opposed to it 14, 15 years ago, that this was controversial. I live in a very conservative, GOP-centric county. Our legislator is Brian Mass. He's formerly a Tea Partyist. The idea of refederalizing this area is going to be a big challenge for somebody like that to support. However, he's quite interested because he's a water guy, and he is struggling against federal bureaucracy regularly. Right now, we've got a train bridge that's going to be closed for a while, and so he's been struggling against the Coast Guard. I was on a call with him today over the LOSM, or the Lake Okeechobee Management Schedule negotiations. We just I don't know if this is terribly germane to your conversations up here, but Lake Okeechobee operating schedule has been something that people in the southern end of the lagoon have been fighting for years. It would give less discharges to the St. Lucie estuary, considerably less discharges to the St. Lucie estuary. But the National Marine Fisheries Service, a department of NOAA, has just recommended an environmental impact review that will stall the adoption of LOSM for another 6 months while they determine whether red tide Carina brevis algae is detrimental to swimming turtles, which means sea turtles. To me, it seems like a no-brainer that yes, obviously, but that, LOSM was going to be adopted in May, next week. It's now not going to be adopted until December at best, and it's also probably going to be renegotiated from a Fort Myers, Caloosahatchee Basin perspective. And so some of the winds that the St. Lucie estuary, and because of that, the Indian River Lagoon, felt as though we had finally achieved, or now sort of dashed, at least for a while. So these are the sort of things that if you stop this state finger pointing and put it under a federal agency's authority, you might be able to befuddle, or at least make more difficult. Now, there are also, Pelican Island National Sanctuary. There is Merritt Island National Sanctuary. There are several other sanctuaries, state and federal, within the IRL. There's clearly going to have to be negotiations about how those fit into the big picture. There are NEPs that exist within the system that will have to be sort of figured out, because the way the IRL NEP works is it's about 50% funded through the EPA and about 25% funded through the state DEP. The other 20-ish% is funded through the St. John's River Water Management District and the South Florida Water Management District. And then the 5 counties that are within the IRL watershed also contribute. And so that's sort of the management structure of that organization is doing really excellent work. And I think that because it already has deep roots or is funded primarily through the EPA, it would be almost a direct flow through. Dwayne DeFries is not entirely sure how national park status is going to help. Of course, there is sort of the insulated political perspective that he's bound to have from being within an agency-funded organization. I'm very much at the sort of the beginning of the inspirational conversations that I'm trying to have with local agencies and organizations like you all. Also trying to inspire thinking outside of the box. I think that a lot of what's happened to Indian River Lagoon health is because we have accepted the new normal as being the status quo, and that we accept what is a challenging change or paradigm shift to be perhaps too hard or somebody else's problem or so difficult in the future that I'm never going to see any progress on this. And I can tell you truthfully that lots of organizations are having a measurable effect in a positive direction on the health of the Indian River Lagoon. You know, I'm clearly biased for the Marine Resources Council, but we last week signed an agreement with a mitigation company that has been doing work for restorations throughout the nation to do another seagrass nursery that is not going to be funded through the NOAA grant funding stream that several of the other seagrass replanting projects were going to be funded through, and will be sort of sporadically funded probably through the municipalities who need to have freshwater tolerant submerged aquatic vegetation to meet their BMAP criteria set by the state DEP. So we're going to be probably working mostly in the tributaries to reduce some of the nutrient loading into the system, because it's a lot easier to not put cream in your coffee than it is to take the cream out after you put the cream in the coffee. And so the more we can work on land use reductions in the nutrient inputs into the lagoon, the better off we're all going to be. And the longer term that healthy, you know, behavioral modification will be instituted. So I'm here to try to answer questions you might have about how you might be able to push this rock a little bit further up the hill, and to also, you know, entertain any of your thoughts about what might be an impediment to getting national park status for the IRL. And I think, you know, if we could work on national monument status, that might be a beginning, and then move to national park status further on. You know, I spoke to the superintendent of Everglades National Park, who is very enthusiastic about it, but he's also cautioning that it's going to be a very difficult, challenging, long road, long-term process. Under the Obama administration, several national parks and marine protected areas were declared. Under the Trump administration, they were removed. Those protections were taken away. Under the Biden administration, they've been slowly reinstituted, but some of the boundaries have changed over time. You know, there's going to be issues with sort of extraction economies that are always going to want to preserve their ability to profit from the resource that is our public property. I mean, this is all state controlled property, and what would be happening if it was, if we were successful in getting this national park status would be to get a federal sort of control over what had been a state water. And so that's probably where the real struggle is going to be, is how do you get the state to relinquish some of the control that they had been enjoying for a long time?